Hey everybody, Lloyd Hendricks here. Today I'd like to speak to you a little bit about an article called A Content Analysis of Violent Penalties and Their Role in Sanitizing NFL Broadcasts by Nikki Lewis and Travis Bell. Just to give you a little bit of background there, this article was published in May of 2024 in the Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media. It was also awarded the title of Best Paper for 2023 by the National Communication Association's Communication and Sport Division, which is pretty neat. The authors, Nikki Lewis is from the University of Kentucky, where she's an associate professor in the College of Communications and Information. Travis Bell is from the University of South Florida, where he works in the Zimmerman School of Advertising and Mass Communications, where Bell, of course, is an associate professor of digital and sports media, as well as the director of graduate programs and research. So the NFL is obviously a huge league. It's got millions and millions of viewers. Even with the growing trend today of media fragmentation with so many different options out there, the NFL and sports in general are one of the few remaining things that people will actually sit through and watch commercials because they want to watch it live, even if they have to be subjected to the commercials. It's very rare that you're able to rewatch a sports program that's not just highlights. If you already know what's happening, it's just kind of boring. So people keep their eyes on it. Their eyes are pretty well glued to it. In 2016, the NFL officially acknowledged the long-term dangers of repeated violent collisions and concussions, and because of that, the league has made some efforts to bring down the number of those violent hits. One of the biggest being some changes to the actual rules of the game. Now, the authors point out that there has been some research done on the concussion issue and the repeated violent hits, and also the audience attitudes regarding the announcers' comments about plays related to those traumatic brain injuries. But it was still unclear about the actual proportion of the plays that are called for those penalties where the traumatic brain injuries are concerned and are also shown actually live and clear on the screen. A lot of times they happen off the screen and they only see them in replays and whatnot. And there also hadn't been a lot of look at what the disposition of the announcers themselves were towards the calls in their commentary. So examples of those TBI concern penalties are things like unnecessary roughness, where somebody might body slam a player or something or hit them after the play. And then roughing the passer, where when the passer throws the ball away, you're not really supposed to touch him at all anymore. And really, you can't touch his helmet at all with your hands. If you slap him in the helmet or something like that, you can be called for those penalties as well. So football has always been a violent collision sport from the very beginning, back in the 1870s when it began to develop. Early on, there were a number of deaths in college games, and in the early 1900s, there were a lot of calls to reduce some of that violence and stop some of those things happening. And even President Teddy Roosevelt in 1905 gathered some league leaders from the Ivy League, where he threatened to ban football altogether if they didn't cut down on some of these deaths. And unfortunately, in spite of this, the game was still popular, and the death totals actually increased in the next few decades, especially after the professional game was actually introduced with the NFL starting in 1920. So the game grew in in attention and popularity as a sport where it's kind of socially acceptable violence is on display. It's sort of like the gladiator arenas of today, where people, aren't actually killed and hurt, and you can watch it and it's okay, right? And football, it just grew, and it's been America's most favorite sport to watch for the last 50 years now. But of course, in the last 25 years or so, there's been a real growing concern about the concussion situation, and especially chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is a degenerative brain disease linked to the long-term effects of repeated violent collisions in football, but they don't necessarily result in actual concussions. They don't necessarily ever get noticed. It's just the sort of long-term effects of it happening over and over and over. So in light of that, the NFL has led the charge to develop some better safety equipment and some better technology to prevent some injuries. And specific to the Lewis and Bell study, they implemented some rule changes in 2009 to try to stop some of those on-field hits that could be considered excessively violent. The two biggest differences being the ban on hits to a defenseless receiver. That's somebody up in the air making a catch. They're coming down and they don't have a way to protect themselves, and you're not allowed to just crash into them anymore like you maybe used to be. back in the day. And there's also, of course, were bans on low hits to the quarterback. That's in the knee area and stuff like that try to prevent injuries to the quarterback. They also implemented a concussion protocol to try to prevent players suffering a concussion from returning to games. You have to go through some tests and on the sideline and look at them like that. So in 2018 and 2019, the rules were updated again. Roughing the passer became more strict, which included tackles where the defender's entire body, you can't just pick the quarterback up, spin him around, smash him down. You can't do that anymore with where your entire weight lands on the quarterback by slamming him down to the ground. They also broadened the definition for a defenseless player, and they implemented a replay review system for some calls as well. So Lewis and Bell use social cognitive theory, or STC, to analyze the audience reactions and feelings about the sanitized violence within the game. If you're not familiar with that, but maybe you're in education, you're probably familiar with the behavioralist theory. Social cognitive theory is pretty similar to behavioralism. In the simplest terms, behavioralist theory looks at how the environment influences behavior of people, but social cognitive theory takes both the environment and other individuals and how that combined influence can affect the behavior of people. It's those interactions there that are really crucial to the understanding there. So from the audience perspective, the writers Lewis and Bell want to know, are the model's behaviors rewarded or punished? Now, obviously, they're not worried about people in the audience going out and start tackling others in the street and things like that. Whereas, sort of behavioralist or modeling theory would lead you to believe. But instead, they're thinking more about these rule changes and their influence on the attitude of the audience regarding that concussion issue, and also their perception of the actual violence within the game. So to determine that, they looked at three aspects. There were things that had been studied before, but never all three things together, right? There were live depiction of violent penalties on the broadcast. It was if and how the violent plays were morally judged by the announcers. And does instant replay affect the moral judgment of those said announcers? To do this, they developed two research questions. The first one was, how were violent penalty-causing acts depicted on screen in 2009 and then compared to 2019? And the second one was, how were violent penalty-causing acts verbally announced on screen in 2009 and in 2019? So a total of 486 penalties were collected to study. The search was done. They needed to have the full data on the penalty call, but they also needed to have the actual TV broadcast as well, which in some cases from 2009, they weren't necessarily available anymore. But a search was done. They found enough info to look at 180 calls from 2009 and 306 calls from 2019. The analysis was done to determine the tone of the announcers to see if the violent acts were actually shown live or if they were shown on replay. And possibly the most important part of it, was there an actual injury involved? So the tone of the announcers would be things like, oh, that's a hard hit. He really deserved that call, Bob. Or, I just don't see it. He barely touched him. And, I think one of the examples that they gave was something about the announcers kind of chuckling about what a silly call it was. And they said he just barely grazed his beard. Just got to protect that beard, make sure it looks right. So they just wanted to try to guess, did the announcers, how did they feel about it? Were they supportive of the call? Were they against the call, etc.? So after their analysis, they found a few main things that were happening. First off, the league became more penalized over time. There was about a 70% increase in 2019 compared to 2009. And second, the penalty-causing actions by the players were mostly seen only on a replay review. They weren't really seen live, mainly because the cameras will follow the ball, and a lot of times as the quarterback is throwing the ball, they'll trace the ball's action, and you just barely miss after the ball is thrown, somebody hitting the quarterback. Now, there are other cameras following them, but the live shot is going to follow the ball. So the chance to see the action several times over in slow motion, though, when they do replay it, turned out to be very, very polarizing in regard to the tone taken by the announcers, with a neutral tone taken only around 30% of the time. The announcing teams typically, they tend to oppose the penalty much more often in 2019, though, compared to 2009. And the replay reviewed plays were opposed by the announcers about 20% of the time. That's 1 in every 5, just about. Many of the comments along the lines of like, that's barely a love tap, or, he maybe barely grazed him or something like that. And they weren't real supportive in those cases. So the important thing here to recognize when we're looking at the number of times that the announcers disagreed with the calls is that the player that was the victim in the call was almost always never actually injured. So the numbers broke down to just about 4% of the time was there a true injury that resulted from the play. So audiences could potentially assume that due to the low occurrence of the injury actually happening during these penalized plays, that the game isn't actually violent at all, because they just pop right up and go back to playing, or maybe they clap, yeah, good call, ref, we get 15 yards, that sort of thing. So in other words, the lack of those injuries resulting from the plays is kind of sanitizing the violence where it doesn't result in any negative consequences, unlike, of course, in the real world. So in addition to that situation there, concussions and CTE were really only mentioned 3 times in all the samples, despite it being really prevalent in the discussions around the sport. And this could, maybe influence audiences to believe that maybe CTE is not that big a concern, and the players, especially the quarterbacks, are way overprotected. The calls are way too strict. So all these things taken together by Lewis and Bell and looked at through a social cognitive theory perspective can give a picture of how the audience is unlikely to see any real negative outcomes for this seemingly violent behavior other than a little 15-yard penalty. And like I said, if you don't have those negative consequences, the violence just seems very, very sanitized. It doesn't seem like there's anything really bad happening, despite the fact that people could have real long-term situational injuries from these repeated hits. It's just not something that was talked about much. So a couple of general conclusions that Lewis and Bell came to after the study was, with no visual and verifiable injuries and the announcers lamenting a call, the absence of those negative consequences that are associated with those violent behaviors can desensitize the audience to the violence that they're seeing on screen, right? And the audience hearing the announcers oppose the penalty calls is a form of rewarding violent behavior, or at the very minimum, not actually punishing violent behavior, which can lead to audiences having greater negative attitude toward those penalties being called, especially when there's no actual injury that was sustained. So a sort of main conclusion to the study is it highlights how the NFL's efforts to police violent penalty-causing plays has begun to create a real negative perception in the eyes of many announcers. And conversely, social cognitive theory would say it has the same backfire effect on the audience watching the game. So looking at all those things, it is also important to consider, what were some of the limits of the study and what could happen in the future. So Lewis and Bell did recognize that their study was fairly limited because they only really had a relatively small sample of NFL plays. There's a lot of plays that happened. They didn't really have that many. So they suggested maybe branching out into the college game as well and seeing how their study would work with college plays also. And they would also like some future work to consider the bias of the announcers making the comments to see, are they media members who have kind of a sort of a duty to report the facts and accurately. Obviously, those kind of things, especially in today's world, are argued. Are they actually doing that or not? And that's a whole different story. But are they media members, or are they also former players or coaches? And investigate how being a media member versus a former player or coach could also affect the opinions and therefore affect what the announcers say to the audience on the screen. So I appreciate you guys listening to me today, and I look forward to checking out everybody else's presentations as well. Thanks a lot.